Hi, in this video I'm going to show you how to cover a button mold with a very thick fabric. This was a special request and it's one that's really pertinent to historical costuming because you still want a nice button even if you're covering the mold with the thick fabric of a wool garment. So let's get started. I was recently asked how to cover a ordinary button mold in a very thick fabric. So this is a thick wool, so that you don't have this weird shape at the back of the button. During a live Zoom course I was giving, I was recently asked how to cover a basic button mold in a thick fabric without there being too much bulk at the back. So I decided I would do a little video showing you what it is that I do. I've cut a circle using, I've drawn round using our button templates. How I've chosen the size, this is just as a guide and it will depend on the button mold and all sorts of other conditions. So you should always do one to make sure you're happy. But for instance, that button mold goes to there. Then the side comes out to about there. And then we're at about half again of the size of the button mold. So basically that translates to it will fold over and not quite reach the center, which is what we're looking for with this particular type of covering. Now you need to have a really strong thread. If you haven't got a really strong thread, I suggest that you use your thread double and that you wax it. I'm going to do that. I've got some cotton, just ordinary cotton sewing thread, but I am going to use it double. And I've knotted the end. I'll just show you in a moment. So I've used it as ordinary sewing thread. And I'm just going to run a little bit of wax along the length of this sewing thread. So first thing to do is to work a back stitch. Then we're going to work small running stitches around the edge of this felt. You can see that this is a very thick felt. It's the sort of felt that a reenactor might use for a coat. In fact, it is actually a scrap that did go into a making an early 18th century coat, or late, something like that. I made the buttons specifically, so it's very, very early on, many years ago. I have this lovely scrap left and I still love this wool. So a good proper wool. So all of this is the normal thing that you would do to make a covered button. Now, having inserted the button, I'm going to go around, and this is where it gets a little bit tougher because you're going through thick fabric and usually a couple of layers. But I'm going to work some running stitches around in a circle again to try to pull this in just a little bit more. Around the edges. And you do have to fight with it a little bit sometimes. Now that's okay, but it's a bit lumpy and bumpy around the edges, and it's really not, it would annoy me anyways. So the next thing to do is hope that my iron is hot. I'm just going to get my little portable ironing pad, and I'm going to spray this with water just to dampen it a little bit. And then I'm going to use a hot iron. Normally, I would try to use the steam function on a big iron because I'm impatient. But I think that using steam underneath my camera probably wouldn't be the wisest option. So we will have to make do with the mini iron. That will take just a little bit longer. Basically, the thing to do is you're pressing, you're not ironing, you're pressing, and you're pressing the back in. And by using a bit of water or steam, you don't want to do too much because you're using a wooden button mold. So of course that, you know, you don't want to risk damaging the button mold itself. But what you do want to do is you want to be able to push in that felt and really give it some pressure. Now, I do like to, I use a pad like this and doubled over because my thinking is I'm not going to crush the face of the button mold too much if I use some padding. So you do have to sort of tread carefully. Okay, so that is starting to flatten out a little. And you can see that the felt is drying off in some places. But we're not finished yet. So that's come round and that's softer now. The felt is actually a little softer. So now we start with a spiral. Now the spiral wrapping is the same with that I use for any covered button, in that you're coming back and forth and you're pulling up. So you can see where there's a bump so that you can take the stitches. That bump means that it's not flat against the edge of the button. Now, of course, you should remember that if you are using covered buttons on 18th century, in particular, garments, that there are certain periods in English history where in England you were not supposed to wear buttons made of the same fabric as the fabric of the coat, the same stuff as the coat. And that was there to protect the livelihoods of the thread button makers. in an attempt to protect their jobs, really. Of course, I get the impression that the legislation was brought out 4 different times, so we have to assume it kept having to be brought out because it was blatantly ignored. So then you can see we're getting a nice shape at the front now. It's starting to look like a nice button. It's still got a bit of bulk. I mean, you will always have a certain amount of bulk at the back. The thinner the button mold, the better when you're using very bulky fabrics. But the fact that the fabric is still just a little damp at the back is really helpful. Now I'm going to run out of thread here, so I'll just weave this through a couple of times before I trim this off. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the iron now. It's a good opportunity to do so. And to press and steam some more, bearing in mind that, as I say, it's still flat, a bit damp. And this will help me to see what areas are just not working flat. Obviously be careful that you don't burn yourself and all the usual safety precautions when you're using hot irons. So getting there, I've got a bit of a bump there that I'm not happy with, and so I will get some more thread onto my needle and wax the thread again so that I can pull quite tightly. And that's the reason for the strong thread, is that you do need to be able to pull. The thing is to make these look really, really good, you do have to spend some time on them if you're using a nice thick wool. However, they will look really, really good. And you spend a bit of time on them, they'll also last that little bit longer as well. So I do have a bit of a pet peeve about covered buttons that have bumps at the side, because it's not really that difficult to spend a little bit of time pulling the thread in, the fabric in. Most of the time you can get it really nice and tidy. Let's see, a little bit of one there. And so it's a little bit different than when you're working with fine fabrics, because when you're working with fine fabrics, this whole process of pulling is much easier and quicker to do. There's one little bit more here. I think we'll probably about do it. Yep, because I've snapped my not strong enough thread. That's all right. That shouldn't make a difference because of the waxed, but let's just do a couple of stitches to make sure. To me, something like that's never the end of the world. We can soon figure it out. Bearing in mind that this is a pretty strong thread. It's still a quilting cotton, but that just shows you how much you have to pull and manipulate when you're working with thick wools, nice thick fabrics. Okay. So what's it look like from the front? I think that looks a lot better. A little bit of a lump right there, I think. So let's see if we can get that one sorted. Yes, that's it. That's pulled in. And then one last press and to get that as flat as possible at the back, because if it's flat at the back, it's going to sit nicer on your garment. And I know I've got people saying, well, how do you attach it? So you will attach it through a shank that you'll make as you sew it on, and that would be correct for 18th century buttons. Yeah, happy with that. It's flattened off really quite a lot when you consider that that much of it anyways is button mold. We've managed to get that nice and flat, which will then sit nicely on any garment or coat. So there you have it. A nice little covered button, covered in thick wool. Thank you very much for watching. I hope that helped and was useful for you. Do please click subscribe and like. It all helps the channel quite a bit.